Hi, and welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Before we dive in, I just want to pause and recognize the courage that it takes to show up to a webinar like this. Many of us don't talk openly about our struggles with food. We carry a lot of shame. We tell ourselves things like, I should be able to handle this, or other people don't seem to have this problem. Why can't I just get it together? And yet you showed up today. That tells me two things about you. First, that you are stronger than you probably realize. And second, that you are hungry for truth, not diet fads, not quick fixes, but a deeper understanding of what's really going on and how healing is possible. I want to assure you that you are not alone. If you've ever felt trapped in cravings, if you've ever felt like food has more power over you than it should, if you've ever promised yourself you'd stop, only to find yourself right back in the same cycle, you're in the right place. This space is safe, supportive, and hopeful. Now, I know that some of you may have tried countless programs, diets, and plans before. You may have spent years battling food, bouncing from one approach to another, only to end back up where you started. And maybe you've started to wonder, is change really even possible for me? If that's how you feel, I just want to say, I see you. And I've seen hundreds of others in the exact same place. What we're going to explore today is not another diet. It's not another trick or hack. What we're going to talk about is the truth that processed foods are addictive, severely addictive. And when we accept the severity of that addiction, everything changes. The shame starts to lift, the struggle starts to make sense, and recovery finally becomes possible. So, again, welcome. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are not hopeless. You are here. And that's the best place to start. So let's talk about why this matters. Processed food addiction is one of the most common and most overlooked addictions in the modern world. Millions of people are affected, yet it's rarely called by its real name. Instead, it hides under labels like emotional eating, overeating, stress eating, or simply a lack of willpower. But here's the truth. What's happening isn't a failure of discipline. It isn't a personal flaw. It's the direct result of how our brains respond to processed foods and how the food industry has deliberately engineered those foods to hook us. Now, I want to paint a picture of what this looks like because I know so many of you will recognize yourself in it. Imagine someone, maybe it's you, who starts the day with the best intentions. They think, I'll eat clean today. I'll be good. I'll stay in control. Breakfast might even go smoothly, but as the day goes on, the cravings start to creep in. And by mid afternoon, that little voice is whispering, just a little won't hurt. You've been good so far. You deserve this. And before long, they're caught in this cycle, eating foods they swore they wouldn't, feeling foggy, guilty, and defeated. Does that sound familiar? Here's why this matters. That's not a story about a lack of willpower. That's a story about addiction, and it's not a moral thing. Processed foods are designed to create dependency. The exact combinations of sugar, flour, fats, and additives light up the brain's reward system in the same way that other addictive substances do. They create a dopamine surge, that little burst of pleasure and relief, which the brain learns to chase again and again. And over time, the brain adapts, requiring more and more of the substance just to feel normal. And so the cycle continues. But because our culture doesn't call this addiction, we end up blaming ourselves. Diet culture tells us if you just tried harder, if you just had more self control, you wouldn't be in this mess. That message is devastating. It creates shame, and shame keeps people trapped. Shame makes us hide. Shame makes us isolate. And shame tells us you're the problem. But the science tells a very different story. The science says your brain has been hijacked. You are not weak. You're addicted. And that shift in perspective changes everything. Why? Because when we see the severity of the addiction, we stop wasting energy, blaming ourselves, and we start putting energy into the things that actually help us heal. Let me share a story, one that I've heard in many forms from members of our community. A woman joined one of our chats and said, I don't think my problem is that serious. I mean, it's not like I'm addicted to drugs or alcohol. I just like food. But then, as she keeps talking, she admitted that she spent hours each day thinking about food. She described how she would hide wrappers in her car so her family wouldn't see. She said she often felt too exhausted to play with her kids after dinner because the food fog would hit her so hard. That's addiction. But she couldn't see it at first because she believed what culture had taught her, that food addiction isn't real. This is why accepting severity matters. When she finally allowed herself to say, okay, this really is an addiction, she stopped treating herself like a failure and started treating herself like someone in recovery. And that's when healing became possible. Here's the big picture. Processed food addiction is severe because it rewires the brain, it damages the body, and it destroys quality of life. It keeps people trapped in cycles of craving, binging, regret, and shame. It robs people of energy, focus, joy, and peace. And yet, because it's not widely acknowledged as an addiction, most people never get the help they need. They get stuck in diets that only make the problem worse. They get stuck in shame spirals. They get stuck thinking they're the only one. But the truth is, this addiction is everywhere. You're not alone. And once you can accept its severity, you finally see the path out of it. So let's bring this back to you. If you've been struggling, it's not because you're weak. It's because you've been fighting a battle without the right map. The enemy isn't your lack of discipline. The enemy is an industry that's designed substances to hook your brain and a culture that taught you to blame yourself for being hooked. That's why today matters, because today we're naming the truth. Today we're saying this is an addiction. It's severe and it's not your fault. And when you see that truth clearly, something shifts inside. The fog starts to lift. You stop carrying the burden of shame and you begin to step into a different kind of future, one where recovery is not only possible, but within your reach. We've talked about why this matters and how processed food addiction is more than just a bad habit. But before we go deeper into the science, I want to slow down and really connect this to what it feels like in daily life. Because addiction doesn't just show up in brain scans or research papers, it shows up in our mornings, in our evenings, in our relationships, and in the way we talk to ourselves. And if you recognize yourself in these stories, I want you to hear me. You are not alone. Everyone who walks into recovery has lived some version of what I'm about to describe. Let's start with one of the most familiar patterns, the cycle of promises and regret. Maybe this sounds familiar. You wake up in the morning with determination. Today is the day. Today, I'm going to be good. I'm going to stay on track. You feel hopeful, even energized. Breakfast might even go smoothly. Maybe you pack a lunch you feel proud of. But by mid afternoon, the cravings creep in. A little voice whispers, just one won't hurt. You've done so well today. You deserve this. You resist at first. You try to distract yourself, but the voice keeps pressing, and eventually you give in. You eat the thing you promised yourself you wouldn't. And for a few minutes, there's relief, that rush of dopamine. But almost immediately, the regret sets in. Why did I do that? I promised myself I wouldn't. What's wrong with me? And then the fog sets in, the tiredness, the irritability, the self blame. You go to bed swearing that tomorrow will be different, only to wake up and repeat the same cycle again. If you've ever lived this pattern, you're not alone. This is what addiction does. Another story that shows up often is the way the addictive voice disguises itself as reason. For example, someone might be driving home after a long day and the thought pops up, you've worked really hard today. You deserve a treat. Or maybe, you'll quit tomorrow. Today's been so stressful. This feels logical. It feels fair. But really, that's the addiction speaking. In our community, we hear these phrases repeated by dozens of people in dozens of voices, and they're always the same. It's like the addiction has a script. And once you recognize it, you realize, wait, that's not me talking. That's the addiction trying to keep its grip. And then there's food fog. So many people live in a state of constant fog without even realizing it. They feel tired all the time. Their thinking feels cloudy. Their moods swing more than they want them to. And they blame themselves. I'm just lazy. I'm just moody. I'm just not disciplined enough. But when you step back and look at it, the fog isn't random. It's the direct result of processed food consumption. It's the brain struggling under the chemical effects of addiction. I remember one community member who said, I didn't even know how foggy I was until the fog started to lift. That's how sneaky it is. You get so used to feeling heavy and cloudy that you forget there's another way to live. And there's also the secrecy that comes with this addiction. How many of us have hidden wrappers in the trash or in the car so no one would see how much we ate? How many of us have made an extra stop at the store and then pretended it never happened? Secrecy thrives in shame, and shame thrives in secrecy. It's a painful loop. But again, it's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of addiction. And then there's the way this addiction spills into every corner of life. Maybe you've missed out on playing with your kids or grandkids because you felt too drained after eating. Maybe you've skipped social events because you were afraid of losing control around food. Maybe you found yourself distracted at work, unable to focus because the food noise in your head was so loud. Processed food addiction doesn't just affect our bodies, it affects our time, our relationships, our confidence, and our joy. Now, I'm not sharing these stories to make anyone feel worse. I'm sharing them because this is what addiction looks like. And if you recognize yourself in these words, I want you to know it's not just you. It's not because you're weak. This is the nature of the substance and the nature of the addiction. And here's the good news. Once you name it, once you start to see the pattern, you begin to separate yourself from it. You realize this isn't my identity. This is something that's happened to me and something I can recover from. The shift from shame to clarity is the beginning of freedom. So now that we've painted this picture of how processed food addiction shows up in everyday life, let's take a closer look at why. Because when you understand the brain science behind it, when you see how dopamine, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala get hijacked, the struggle finally makes sense. And when it makes sense, you stop blaming yourself and you start believing in the possibility of recovery. Now that we've walked through what processed food addiction feels like in daily life, let's talk about what's actually happening inside the brain. Because when you understand the science, you can finally stop blaming yourself. You can see that the struggle isn't about being weak. It's about how these substances hijack the brain's reward systems. Our brains are wired to keep us alive. And at the center of this system is dopamine, a chemical that tells us, that felt good, do it again. In a natural environment, dopamine motivates us towards things that help us survive, like finding food, seeking shelter, connecting with others, accomplishing meaningful goals. And we do one of these things, the brain gives us a gentle surge of dopamine, enough to say, yes, that's worth repeating. But processed foods don't give us a gentle nudge. They deliver a hijack. The combination of sugar, refined flour, fats, and chemical flavorings creates a dopamine surge that is far more powerful than anything found in nature. It's the difference between a quiet doorbell and a blaring fire alarm. At first, this feels good, but the brain quickly adapts. The dopamine receptors become less sensitive, meaning you need more of the substance to get the same effect. That's called tolerance. And once tolerance sets in, the brain begins to treat the substance like a survival requirement. This is why cravings feel like emergencies. They're not just random thoughts about food, they're full body signals coming from a brain that has decided, I need this in order to live. It's the same process that happens with nicotine, alcohol, or other addictive substances. The brain misfires and interprets the substance as essential to life. So when you're standing in front of the pantry and you feel that almost panicky urgency, that's not you being weak. That's your brain firing off a false survival alarm. Now let's talk about the part of the brain that helps us make decisions, the prefrontal cortex. This is the area right behind your forehead. It's what allows you to set goals, weigh circumstances, and resist impulses. It's the part of you that says, I want to be healthy. I want to stay on track. But here's the problem. When dopamine surges and cravings hit, the prefrontal cortex gets overridden by deeper, older parts of the brain. It's like a parent trying to reason with a toddler who's having a meltdown. Logic doesn't stand a chance. That's why so many people say, I knew what I was doing, I just couldn't stop myself. It's not an excuse, it's neuroscience. And then there's the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm center. When the brain believes a survival need is being threatened, the amygdala fires up feelings of panic, anxiety, and urgency. That's why cravings don't just feel like wanting, they feel like emergencies. The amygdala makes sure you pay attention. It says, drop everything and get what you need. This is why cravings can override every good intention you had that morning. The brain is literally telling you that you're in danger if you don't comply. And then there's food fog. Food fog is the lingering state of fatigue, irritability, and cloudy thinking that comes from regular exposure to processed foods. It's not just in your head, it's the result of your brain chemistry being out of balance. When dopamine is constantly being overstimulated, when the prefrontal cortex is constantly being overridden, then the amygdala is constantly being triggered. The whole system runs hot. And just like an overheated engine, the brain can't function at its best. That's why people report feeling mentally cloudy, emotionally unstable, and physically drained when processed foods are part of their daily life. It's the chemical evidence of addiction. Now, I know all of this can sound overwhelming, but here's the hopeful part. The brain is plastic. That means it can change. When you begin to reduce your exposure to processed foods and when you surround yourself with recovery cues instead of addictive cues, the brain begins to repair itself. Dopamine levels start to normalize. The prefrontal cortex gets stronger. The amygdala quiets down, and the food fog begins to lift. This is why people in recovery often say things like, I feel like myself again. I can think clearly. I finally have peace. It's not magic, it's neuroscience in action. So let's bring this together. Processed foods hijack the brain's reward system with dopamine surges. The prefrontal cortex, the decision-making center, gets overridden. The amygdala fires off false survival alarms, making cravings feel urgent. Food fog sets in as a lingering symptom of addiction. And yet, because most people don't understand this, they think it's their fault. They think they're weak, lazy, or broken. But the science makes it clear. This isn't weakness. This is addiction. And once you can see it for what it is, you can finally start to move toward recovery with compassion for yourself. Now, there's another piece we need to talk about, and that's denial. Because even when we hear this science, even when we know the cravings are false survival signals, the addictive voice still tries to convince us otherwise. It says, you're overreacting. Everyone eats this. It's not that bad. Denial is part of the addiction itself. And next, we'll talk about how denial works and how acceptance becomes the doorway to freedom. We've just talked about how processed foods hijack the brain. We've seen how dopamine, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala all get pulled into the cycle of addiction. But there's another piece of the puzzle, one that can be just as powerful as cravings, and that's denial. Here's what's important to understand. Denial isn't a character flaw. It isn't a sign that you're lying to yourself on purpose. Denial is part of the addiction itself. When the brain tags a substance as essential for survival, it will also generate thoughts to protect access to that substance. This is what we call the addictive voice. It's the brain's way of saying, don't take this away from me. So if you've ever felt like your brain was working against you, it's because, in a way, it was. The addiction literally defends itself by producing denial. Denial often sounds ordinary. It sounds like logic, like reason, like common sense. Here are some of the phrases we hear all the time. It's not that bad. Everyone eats this. Why should I be different? We can quit tomorrow. You deserve this. One bite won't hurt. This isn't really addiction. You're just being dramatic. Do any of those sound familiar? These phrases are the language of denial. They're not your true voice. They're the addiction speaking through you, trying to maintain access to the substance. Denial is persuasive because it often plays to our emotions and our fears. Take, you deserve this. That taps into our need for comfort and fairness. It feels soothing in the moment, even though it leads us back into the cycle of regret. Or, everyone eats this. That appeals to our need to belong. It tells us, don't be different, don't stand out, don't make life harder than it needs to be. Or, it's not that bad. That plays into our fear of facing the full reality. Because if it really is that bad, then change becomes urgent and unavoidable, and that can feel overwhelming. So denial works by telling us the things we most want to hear. That's why it's so hard to fight alone. Here's the good news. Once you start to recognize denial as a pattern, it begins to lose its grip. In our community, one of the most powerful experiences people have is hearing someone else say the exact same thing they've been telling themselves privately. When you hear another member say, my brain told me that it's not that bad, that I could handle it, you realize, oh, wait, that's not my unique thought. That's the addiction talking. That recognition is so freeing because the moment you see the addictive voice for what it is, you create distance. You realize, that's not me. That's the addiction trying to survive. Denial says, it's fine. It's not really a problem. You don't need to change. Acceptance says, this really is addiction. This really is affecting me deeply. And I don't have to do this alone. Denial keeps us stuck in the cycle. Acceptance opens the door to recovery. And remember, acceptance doesn't mean giving up or resigning yourself to a life without joy. Acceptance means clarity. It means telling the truth, and from that truth, building a path forward. I'll never forget one member who came into our community saying, I don't think I'm addicted. I just like food. I just have a sweet tooth. But week after week, she started to notice the patterns. She heard other people describing hiding wrappers, planning binges, feeling foggy, battling shame. And one day she said, I realized every story I've heard here could have been mine. Maybe this really is addiction. That moment of acceptance changed everything for her because once she named it, she could start using the tools of recovery instead of beating herself up for being weak. Denial feels protective, but it's actually what keeps us trapped. It silences our inner truth. It tells us we're fine when we're not. But the hopeful part is this. The moment you start to see denial for what it is, the illusion breaks. And once the illusion breaks, the addiction starts to lose power. Every time you catch the addictive voice saying, it's not that bad, And you reply, actually, it is. You reclaim a little more of your freedom. So if denial is the addiction's way of keeping us hooked, then acceptance is the way we break free. Acceptance doesn't come all at once. It grows slowly as we notice the patterns, as we listen to others, as we gently tell ourselves the truth. And that's what we talk about next, how acceptance isn't resignation, but clarity. How acceptance takes away shame and opens the path to peace. We've talked about denial, how the addictive voice works to protect the addiction by convincing us that it's not really a problem. Now I want to talk about the opposite of denial, acceptance. And I want to start by saying this very clearly. Acceptance is not resignation. When people first hear the word acceptance, they sometimes think it means giving up. They think it means saying, well, I guess this is just my life now. I'll never be free. But that's not what I'm talking about. Acceptance and recovery means clarity. It means naming the truth. It means saying, this really is addiction. It really does affect me deeply. And because it's real, I can begin to heal. When denial is running the show, it feels chaotic. You're bouncing back and forth between hope and regret, between control and relapse, between promises and shame. But when acceptance begins to grow, there's a shift. It might not be dramatic at first, but it's noticeable. Acceptance feels like relief. Relief that you don't have to keep pretending it's not that bad. Relief that you don't have to carry the weight of self blame. Relief that there is an explanation for what you've been going through. Acceptance feels like putting down a heavy backpack you didn't even realize you were carrying. Here's why acceptance matters so much. Until we accept the severity of the addiction, we can't direct our energy toward recovery. Think about it. If you're still telling yourself, this is just a bad habit, I just need more discipline, then all your energy goes into trying harder, white knuckling, or beating yourself up when you fail. But once you accept this is addiction and it's not my fault, you can put your energy where it belongs, into building safety, creating community, and using the tools that actually work for recovery. Acceptance reroutes your energy from shame to healing. Acceptance takes courage because it means facing reality, and reality can feel scary sometimes. It can feel overwhelming to say, yes, this is addiction, because then what? Then we have to do something about it. But here's the paradox. The moment you stop running from the truth, you actually feel lighter. Because the truth, no matter how hard it feels at first, is what sets you free. One of our community members said it this way: I was terrified to say that I was addicted. But once I said it, I realized I wasn't fighting myself anymore. I could finally begin to fight the addiction instead of fighting me. Another reason acceptance is so powerful is that it dissolves shame. Shame thrives in secrecy. Shame thrives when we believe the problem is us. When we accept this is addiction and it's not my fault, the shame begins to crack. You stop seeing yourself as broken and you start seeing yourself as someone who is in recovery. And that identity shift changes everything. Acceptance also leads to peace, not immediate, perfect peace, but the beginning of peace. When you accept the severity of the addiction, you stop living in the exhausting back and forth of denial. You stop bargaining with yourself. You stop pretending. And instead, you begin to settle into clarity. You begin to trust that the fog can lift, that the cravings can lose their power, and that you can build a different life. That's why we say acceptance isn't the end of the story, it's the doorway to freedom. So, what does acceptance actually sound like in practice? It sounds like this. Yes, this is addiction. It explains why I've struggled for so long. No, it's not my fault. My brain has been hijacked, and that's what addictions do. Yes, I can heal. The brain is plastic. Recovery is possible. No, I don't have to do this alone. There are communities and tools that can help me. These are the kinds of truths that we practice saying to ourselves and to each other in recovery. And over time, they become the new voice that guides us forward. I think of one member who struggled for years with dieting. She said, every January I'd start again, and every March I'd crash and burn. I thought I was just weak. I thought I had no willpower. But when she finally said, this is addiction, something shifted. She stopped beating herself up for every relapse. She stopped seeing herself as broken, and she started using the tools of recovery, showing up to chats, practicing affirmations, building protective routines. She told us later the biggest change wasn't even the food, it was the peace. I stopped hating myself. I started to believe I could actually heal. That's what acceptance does. It brings peace. So if denial keeps us stuck, acceptance moves us forward. But here's the thing, acceptance rarely happens in isolation. Most of us can't break through denial on our own because the addictive voice is just too convincing. That's why community is so important. And that's what we'll talk about next. How being in community helps us see the patterns more clearly, dissolve shame, and build the safety that we need for recovery. We've seen how denial works and how acceptance brings clarity. But here's the truth, most of us can't get to acceptance on our own. The addictive voice is just too convincing when we're isolated. That's why community is so important, and that's why our community exists. Addiction thrives in isolation. When you're alone, the addictive voice sounds like your own. It says, this isn't that serious. You can stop tomorrow. Everyone eats like this. And because there's no one else to challenge it, you believe it. But when you step into a community, especially one where everyone is working through the same addiction, something shifts. You hear someone else say the exact words that you thought only lived in your head. I told myself today that just one bite wouldn't hurt. Or I promised myself I'd do better tomorrow. And suddenly you realize, wait, that's not my unique weakness. That's the addiction talking. It says the same thing to everyone. That moment is powerful because the instant you realize the addictive voice as a pattern, not your identity, it begins to lose its grip. Community also dissolves shame. When you're struggling alone, it feels personal. It feels like a secret failure. You think, if anyone knew how much I eat in secret or how often I've failed, they'd be horrified. But when you bring that story into a safe group and hear people respond with, me too, I've done that, I get it, the shame just evaporates. Belonging is one of the most powerful antidotes to addiction because shame says you're alone, you're broken, there's something wrong with you. Belonging says you're one of us, you're human, you're recovering. That's what our community provides, a protective environment where recovery can take root. In our community, we use daily chats, group calls, and affirmations to build a buffer against the food industry's constant cues. Think about it. 98% of the messages your brain receives every day are from the food industry. Advertisements, billboards, social media, grocery aisles. All of those messages are designed to trigger cravings and to keep the addiction alive. Without protection, it's almost impossible to stand against that flood. But our community provides counter messaging, safe, recovery based voices that help retrain the brain. When you show up to a chat, you're not just talking, you're rewiring your brain to recognize addiction, resist denial, and believe in recovery. Let me give you a few examples of the tools we use here in this community. First one is affirmations. Short, powerful statements that remind the brain of truth, like, this addiction is not weakness. I am safe. I am recovering. Repetition builds new neural pathways. Another is protective routines. Scheduling chats, listening to podcasts, or reading recovery materials at regular times. These routines create predictable cues of safety, which slowly overpower the industry's cues. Shared language. Words like addictive voice or food fog give us a way to name experiences that used to feel chaotic. Naming things brings calm and control. Connection. Simply being with people who get it is healing. When you log into a call and hear voices that understand, the isolation cracks. Together, these tools create an environment where recovery isn't just possible, it becomes the new normal. One member told us she used to think she could do it alone. She'd say, I don't need a group, I just need more discipline, but she kept relapsing. Finally, she started showing up to our chats. She was quiet at first, just listening. But one day she shared, the addictive voice told me yesterday that I deserved it, and I gave in. Immediately, three other members resounded with their own testimonies. Me too. That's exactly what mine says. She told us later, that moment changed everything. I realized it wasn't me who was broken. It was the addiction using the same script on all of us. That's the power of community. It unmasks the addiction and restores your sense of self. Over time, being in a community becomes more than a tool, it becomes a lifestyle. Our community isn't just a place you drop into when things get bad. It's a place you live in, a place you belong to. It becomes the environment that supports your recovery day after day. And that's the goal, not just to fight cravings in the moment, but to create a whole life that's stronger than the addiction. So we've seen why community matters so deeply. It exposes denial, dissolves shame, and gives us tools to build a protective environment. Next, I want to shift into some gentle practices you can try. These aren't demands or shoulds, just invitations. Ways to begin noticing the addictive voice, reflecting on food fog, and imagining freedom. Small, simple steps that can start to shift your brain toward recovery. We've spent some time looking at the science and the power of community. Now I want to shift gears into something practical, some gentle first steps you might begin to explore. And I want to be clear from the beginning, these are not requirements. They're not homework assignments. They're invitations, little openings you can step into if and when you feel ready. In our community, we believe in moving slowly. The slower you go, the steadier your recovery will be. So take these as possibilities, not prescriptions. The first step is to notice the addictive voice. The addictive voice often sounds like your own thoughts. It says things like, it's not that bad. You deserve this. You'll quit tomorrow. Everyone eats this. Why should you be any different? When you hear one of these phrases, you don't have to fight it. You don't have to argue with it. You don't have to try to make it go away. All you need to do is notice it. That's the addiction talking. By naming it, you create just a little bit of space between yourself and the voice. And in that space, recovery begins. Step 2, reflect on food fog. The second gentle practice is to reflect on food fog. Food fog is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that processed foods are addictive. It's that heavy, cloudy feeling, low energy, poor focus, irritability. Many people live in food fog for so long that it starts to feel normal. But when you pause and ask yourself, when do I notice the fog the most? You begin to connect the dots. You see that the fog isn't random. It's connected to the cycle of addiction. That awareness doesn't force you to make a change immediately. It just helps your brain recognize that the normal you've been living with isn't actually normal. It's the fog of addiction. And once you see that clearly, your brain begins to long for clarity instead of fog. And step 3 is to imagine freedom. The third practice is to imagine freedom. Now, I'm not talking about forcing yourself to set big goals or make radical changes. I'm talking about gently picturing what life could feel like without the constant pull of processed foods. Maybe you imagine walking through a grocery store without being triggered by every aisle. Maybe you imagine waking up clear-headed without food noise rattling in your brain. Maybe you imagine sitting down to a meal and actually feeling peace instead of panic. Imagination is powerful. Neuroscience shows us that the brain responds to imagined experiences almost as if they were real. When you picture yourself free, you're giving your brain a new map, a new vision to work toward. Step number 4, anchor in safety. Another gentle step is to reflect on what makes you feel safe when cravings hit. For some, it's logging into a community chat. For others, it's taking a few deep breaths or repeating an affirmation like, "This addiction is not weakness, I am safe." You already have anchors in your life, things that help you feel grounded when stress or cravings hit. Part of recovery is simply noticing what those anchors are and leaning into them more often. Step 5, take one tiny step. Finally, you might ask yourself, what's one small step that feels gentle and doable for me right now? Not 10 steps, not a dramatic overhaul, just one. It could be noticing the addictive voice once today. It could be jotting down when you feel food fog. It could be sharing one reflection in a safe community. Recovery isn't built on giant leaps. It's built on small, steady steps. And the slower you go, the stronger your foundation becomes. One of our community members once told us she used to think recovery had to be all or nothing. She believed she had to overhaul her entire life in one day. And every time she tried, she ended up crashing. The pressure was too much, and the relapse was devastating. But when she came into the community and heard, the slower you go, the further you'll get, something shifted. She decided her first step would simply be to notice her addictive voice once a day. That was it. And over time, that one small step grew into more. She started reflecting on her food fog. She began to imagine freedom. And eventually, she built a recovery that lasted. Her story is a reminder that the gentle way is the powerful way. So these are some gentle first steps: noticing the addictive voice, reflecting on food fog, imagining freedom, anchoring in safety, and taking one tiny step at a time. None of them require perfection. None of them require you to be ready for a big change. They're just ways of opening the door a little wider. And once that door begins to open, the journey becomes possible. Next, I want to talk about what that journey looks like, the hope of recovery, the healing of the brain, and the way community sustains change. We've talked about denial, acceptance, community, and gentle first steps. Now, I want to pull all of this together into what I believe is the most important message of this workshop. Recovery is possible. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Recovery is possible, not just for some people, not just for the lucky ones, but for you. One of the most hopeful truths about neuroscience is that the brain is plastic. That means it can change. The same brain that has been hijacked by processed foods can begin to repair itself. The dopamine system can calm down. The prefrontal cortex can grow stronger. The amygdala can quiet down. The food fog can lift. This doesn't happen overnight, but with time, safety, and connection, the brain begins to rewire. And as it does, you start to notice the difference. Cravings that once felt like emergencies lose their urgency. Thoughts that once felt overwhelming quiet down. The fog that once felt permanent begins to clear. And in that clarity, you discover something you may not have felt in years: peace. Think about what life would feel like without the constant food noise in your head. Imagine waking up in the morning without bargaining with yourself about what you'll eat that day. Imagine moving through your day without that constant hum of craving in the background. Imagine sitting down to a meal and feeling calm, not chaotic. That's what recovery makes possible. It doesn't mean life becomes perfect. It doesn't mean you'll never feel stress or temptation again. But it means food no longer runs the show. It means you're free to live your life instead of living in the grip of addiction. And here's the other hopeful truth: recovery is sustainable when you walk it with others. If you try to do this alone, the addictive voice will keep finding ways to pull you back. But in our community, you're never alone. You have people to remind you that the voice saying just one bite is the same voice they hear. You have people to encourage you when the fog feels heavy. You have people to celebrate with you when you notice even the smallest bit of freedom. That shared journey is what makes recovery last, because belonging is stronger than shame, and community is stronger than cravings. I want to share just one more story. A man came into our community convinced he was hopeless. He had tried every diet. He had lost and regained weight dozens of times. He said, "I just don't believe recovery is possible for me." But he kept showing up. He listened. He began to notice his addictive voice. He reflected on his food fog. He started using affirmations. Slowly, he began to change. The cravings grew quieter. The fog began to lift. And one day, he said in a chat, "I feel like I finally have my life back. Not because I'm perfect, but because I'm not alone." That's what recovery looks like. It's not instant transformation. It's slow. It's steady. It's healing. And it's possible for anyone who's willing to walk the journey. So here's my invitation to you. If you've seen yourself in the stories I've shared today, if you felt the food fog, the cravings, the denial, the shame, if you've longed for peace but wondered if it's possible for you, then I want you to know there's a place for you here. Our community is not about perfection. It's not about pressure. It's not about going faster than you're ready to go. Our community is about building recovery one small step at a time, surrounded by people who get it. We are a community that believes in gentle progress, in moving slowly, and in celebrating every bit of freedom along the way. Here's what the path can look like. You start by noticing the addictive voice, the food fog, the moments when cravings feel overwhelming. You begin to accept, naming the truth that this is really an addiction and it's not your fault. You connect, showing up to chats, hearing other voices, realizing you're not alone. And you heal slowly, gently, step by step as your brain rewires and the fog lifts. This is not a quick fix. It's not a crash course. It's a way of life, and it's a way of life that brings freedom, peace, and clarity. So, my invitation to you today is simple. Don't walk this journey alone. Recovery is possible, and it's even more possible when you walk it with others who understand. In just a moment, we'll close with some encouragement and take your questions. But before we do, I want you to hold on to this truth. You're not broken, you're not weak, and you're not hopeless. You are in recovery, and recovery is a journey that we take together. Well, we've covered a lot today. We've talked about the daily struggles that so many of us face, the cycle of promises and regret, the addictive voice, the food fog, the secrecy and shame. We've looked at the brain science that explains why this isn't failure of willpower, but a severe addiction. And we've seen how denial keeps us stuck and how acceptance brings clarity and peace. We've talked about the power of community, the gentle steps that make recovery possible, and the hope of a life beyond cravings. So let me bring all of this together with a few final truths that I want you to carry with you. Truth one, this is a real addiction. If you take nothing else from today, I hope you take this. What you've been struggling with is not weakness. It's not laziness. It's not a character flaw. It's addiction. Processed foods are engineered to hijack your brain. The cravings, the food fog, the denial, they're not your fault. They're the symptoms of addiction. Naming it for what it is the first step toward freedom. Truth two, acceptance is clarity. The second truth is that acceptance is not defeat. Acceptance is clarity. When you accept the severity of processed food addiction, you stop wasting energy on shame and self-blame. You start putting your energy where it belongs, into healing, into community, into recovery. Acceptance isn't the end of the story. It's the doorway to peace. Truth three, the brain can heal. The third truth is that the brain can heal. The same brain that has been hijacked can rewire itself. Dopamine levels can rebalance. The prefrontal cortex can strengthen. The amygdala can quiet. And as this happens, the food fog begins to lift, cravings lose their urgency, and you begin to feel like yourself again. Healing is possible. Truth four, you don't have to do this alone. The final truth is this: you don't have to walk this road by yourself. Addiction thrives in isolation, but it loses power in connection. In community, you realize the addictive voice isn't unique to you. It's the same script it tells everyone. You realize you're not broken, you're not strange, you're not hopeless, you're human, and you're recovering. That's what our community offers, a safe space to walk this journey together, slowly, gently, one step at a time. Before we move into your questions, I want to leave you with some encouragement. If you're sitting here thinking, this all sounds good, but I don't know if I can do it, I want you to know you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to overhaul your life tomorrow. Recovery is not about rushing. It's not about perfection. It's about noticing one thought, one craving, one moment of food fog, and it's gently reminding yourself this is addiction, not weakness. I'm not alone. I can heal. Every small step you take in that direction builds momentum. Every moment of clarity builds strength. And every time you connect with others, you reinforce your recovery. You are already on the path simply by being here today. Now, I want to open the space for your questions. Maybe you want to ask about the science, how dopamine works, or why cravings feel so urgent. Maybe you want to share your own experience, a time when you noticed food fog, or a phrase the addictive voice tells you again and again. Maybe you just want to say, yes, I see myself here. Whatever it is, this is your time. There are no wrong questions, no wrong shares. This is a safe space. And as we transition into that, let me say one last thing. You're not alone. You're not broken. You're not weak. You are in recovery, and recovery is possible. Together, we are learning to accept the severity of processed food addiction. Together, we are walking out of the food fog and into freedom. Together, we are reclaiming our lives. Thank you for showing up today. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for taking this step toward clarity and healing. And now let's move into your questions.